What's going on, team? I walked past this house the other week and thought it had some serious potential. So I modeled it up on ArchiCAD and decided to do a full renovation. Obviously, I have no idea what's happening inside this house. All I was able to utilize is some basic Google Street View information and general geometric site layouts that I could make out from what I could see. Nevertheless, it was a very typical Australian brick and tile house built way back in the early 60s, if not even the early 50s. But what was interesting about it to me was the fact that it was so deep and so far below the street level that it was buried from all the other surrounding houses. Often when you see something like this, you have beautiful subterranean garages, you have amazing architecture, but you don't often see single-story homes just nestled underground. Obviously, for the purpose of this, it was quite clear that it was dropped down below ground because that's the way the natural contours went. However, I thought there was so much potential. So that's why today I wanted to share with you exactly how I took this house from a boring, basic, black and white brick box to an elegant architectural masterpiece. Now, there's a few elements within this concept that were critical for me to be able to actually introduce. So as you can see at the start here, the biggest and most important element was the entire front yard was simply sloping from street down to the house itself, and it was completely dead space. There was no utilization of it at all. There was one tree in real life in front of the house that was, again, blocking just the whole house so you couldn't even see it from the street, which for some people might be amazing, but from an architectural perspective, utilization of space and maximization of plot ratios, it wasn't really ideal. So straight away, I decided to start cutting out the entire site. On a site like this, again, without knowing too much, it would most likely be a grout injection into the sides and the neighbors and underneath the verge, and then that way you could come in with an excavator, clean out the site, and build your retaining walls as close as you needed to. Because these retaining walls weren't interior, they wouldn't need to be 100% waterproof, so you could bring them closer to the boundary than necessarily you would for a house. So it provided us with an extra level of outdoor living at the front yard. Now I noticed there was two spaces for outdoor living, one directly to the left of the main driveway and one directly to the right. The right was a little bit small. It was predominantly just landscaping at the moment. So I decided to retain that as landscaping because there isn't too much you can use in 1 meter, but at the same time, it is quality landscaping for street appeal. On the other side though, there was so much room that you could create a whole outdoor entertaining space. Now, where I live, there is winds coming from all directions all year round. Sometimes they come from the west, sometimes they come from the east, sometimes you get northerlies, sometimes you get southerlies. So you really can't bank on having one outdoor living area or one outdoor entertaining area that's going to serve you year round. That way, by being able to incorporate multiple living areas or multiple outdoor living areas, more importantly, you're able to progress as the seasons change and as the winds change. So without knowing too much about the site, without knowing too much about the house itself and the interiors, it is still very much common sense for me to introduce a secondary outdoor living area. And that would be directly out the front of whatever these rooms are inside this building. Now, the building itself lacked a sense of direction, it lacked a sense of purpose, and it didn't really have any natural travel paths. You walk down the driveway, you were greeted with 2 roller doors and a door. You weren't really sure where the entry was. It was a little bit confusing. So that's why I decided to actually split it into multiple sections. We had that new introduction of the outdoor living space. Then we had a parallel wall structure that guided guests from the main street into the main door. And then we of course had our subterranean garage. It might not actually be subterranean, but for the purpose of this, let's go with it. Now, by introducing those 2 linear parallel walls, we obviously create a visual guiding line from the front of the house to the entry itself. But at the same time, we've cut out a lot of earth, which means we've created some incredibly dangerous spaces within our own property. That's not something we can just simply leave and forget about. It's something we have to address. There are a number of growing architectural trends at the moment, moving away from glass balustrades and moving towards pick-style fencing. The pick-style fencing is what I've articulated here in this model, which is very simple, elegant, clean architectural balustrading. There's one bracing bar across the bottom, and the rest are just freestanding columns with no top bracing. By introducing something like this, we're staying with the architectural trends of the current time, but it also gives us an opportunity later on to bring back the original architecture of these arches and curves, which we'll see shortly. Now, the pick fencing, part of it is very linear, but you also have the ability to add curves naturally. So that's exactly what I did. By introducing a simple curve at the end of the retaining wall, it allows us to curve the pick fencing, tie that architectural language back into the original architecture of the arches, and then continue to make that architectural language consistent throughout the project. Now, because this house was sunken so far underneath the natural ground level and below the street level, it seemed strange to me that you could just add another story, yes, and you would create articulation, but there was no forward and back projections. There was no articulation from a sense of depth. It was only verticality. So that's why I started to introduce this hood, I'll call it for lack of a better word. It's 2 concrete walls and a concrete extended slab projection in front of the garage and in front of whatever those rooms are. This projection not only helps with waterproofing of the garage and the windows and everything in itself, but it also allows us to add that depth of projection and better articulation to the overall architectural design language. With that hood introduced, I can then start to think about the walls of the main facade. Now, the garage, it is designed to be subterranean basically, so subterranean garages are ideally meant to disappear from sight. For me, that means nice black architectural cladding completely tucked away, so yes, you can still see it, but it would be a secret garage, and that way, the positioning of the house made more logical sense to the actual architectural language rather than just taking a house, dropping it, and leaving it where it is because that's the way the lay of the land is. When it came to windows in this design, I wanted to respect the original architecture. I didn't have to, it's a massive alteration and renovation project, so it doesn't look anything like the first project did. But I felt like with the curves and the original architecture, it would be really nice to introduce some of those arches back in. And as we're probably well aware of, arches are very much back in architecture now in 2024. Therefore, I was taking an educated guess, be able to remove the existing windows that were already on site and introduce a third potentially in the middle. The reality of that third window may or may not be true. The third window may or may not have to be removed if this project were viable and if it were real. But I know for certain that 2 of those windows could be replicated in the exact same spot as the original windows are, and we could simply cut them lower and cut them higher and introduce some beautiful arched windows. In addition with the arched windows, like I said before, the entry of this house was really lacking. There was no clear entry, so whenever a guest was to arrive, you wouldn't really know where to direct them or where they should be going. So a portico or a porch section was ideal to be able to be introduced into this project as a sense of directional guidance. Now, once again, I opted for those arches with the modern architectural language that we're striving for in this design. I did have hopes that this small outdoor living area could potentially be a half-court basketball court, and I tried to mess with that a little bit, but as you saw, it's just way too small, no chance you'd fit a basketball court in. You could definitely add a hoop for some kids to play around and have some fun if you wanted to, but otherwise it would be a beautiful landscaped area, potentially a fire pit, just a really nice outdoor seating area that would be protected from the wind almost all of the time because it is sunken and protected by 3 sides and the house itself. Now, previously this house had side access through what appeared to be a side gate, but I didn't see that of much value. Instead, I saw it as a security risk. So I removed that side gate, reintroduced additional planters, and introduced additional security screens. So yes, anybody could enter the main house through that walkway stepping down from the street, but then you'd just be greeted with the front door and it'd be secure. There was no way to get into the house without jumping fences or actually being noticed. Now that we had most of the lower ground floor kind of there with the general ideas that I had, which was introducing an additional outdoor living space to be able to be protected from the winds all year round, ensuring that main entry was articulated properly and there was natural guiding lines from the street, creating that subterranean garage feel by completely blacking it out and hiding the actual garage door, and then of course adding some landscaping and some pick fencing for some street appeal, we can start moving on to some higher elements in the design. With that being said, the landscaping element is very critical to me as an architect. I like to introduce as much landscaping as humanly possible into the design. And there's some incredible products that we can use to really reduce the depth of the soil and still be able to grow some amazing cascading plants. So that's why I introduced a very shallow planter box in that hood, which would then cantilever out 1 meter past the building line itself. And all those plants could naturally grow, cascade down, and be easily maintained from inside the house through either an extended balcony or some sort of maintenance deck. The one thing I did forget to mention is at the bottom on the ground floor, I found some dead space and wasted space. Now, this house was relatively close to the ocean, so I thought, why not take the opportunity to introduce a nice little secret shower rain head. So once you're coming home from the beach, you can quickly just wash off there, enter through your secret garage and go into your house clean. Moving on to the upper floor, without knowing what this house actually looks like inside, it's incredibly difficult to understand what's going on. But the best way you can do a renovation is by aligning walls of the new floor with the walls of the lower floor. So that's exactly what I tried to do. I tried to align all of the upper floors with the walls below. That way, the structural loads were carried through top down and it wouldn't be causing too much of a massive disturbance to the underlying structure. Alongside that, I introduced a secondary awning at the top level to mimic that of the architectural hood down below. Now, in this scenario, it is just drawn out of a straight slab, which is potentially concrete with a concrete roof. Otherwise, it could be something as simple as EPS foam battened out, trussed out, or a steel hood wrapped and folded. There's so many scenarios and different ways we can create this hood without using concrete. It's just mass modeling at the time being. Now, because this was facing a very public street and there was no views of the public street, obviously it's a typical Australian neighborhood, I wanted to hide and privatize that top floor as much as possible, and that was done through a unique batten screening system. Now, these hollow tubular steel members are easy to install, they're relatively cheap, and they're easy enough to clean. You just hose them down with a pressure cleaner. So that's exactly what I opted for, a very narrow spaced circular tube rain screen that went all the way around the facade. Once again, because I had no idea what was going on inside, I decided to introduce an additional highlight window across the entire top floor. This way, that highlight ring window could provide lighting to almost any space inside, regardless of what was going on. If we needed skylights as well, we could introduce them simply into that space without causing havoc to the downstairs. By setting that highlight window back from the street as well, it would mean additional structural steel members to support those upper walls. However, it does also mean that the visual bulk and scale was reduced because we're pushing the overall height of the building away from the street, away from the visual perspective of anybody standing there. So that way, the house still looks low, it still looks clean, it still looks modern, and we only see the very slim nature of those highlight windows jutting through at the top. As always, like all of my designs, I introduce a beautiful LED strip light into that hood. That way, that signature is always there and it illuminates the tubular steel at nighttime and makes sure that house stands out day or night. After that top floor was relatively finished, I decided to go back to the main entry of the house. It just wasn't standing out enough. And with a main architectural entry, you want it to speak volumes, you want it to be noticeable, you want it to carry that language throughout the entire design. So I changed and changed and changed and changed until I was relatively happy with what that entry portico could look like. I explored different colors, textures, materials, depths, scales, volumes, all of which at the end didn't seem to really work for this particular entry. Now, yes, they all do generally work and there is a sense of grandeur and scale to them, and it definitely identifies that main entry. However, it just seemed too bland, too repetitive, and not thought out from the wind patterns and how the rain would come in. If you're going to create a porch that is screened and sheltered, you want to be able to think about the winds itself, how that rain is going to drive in, and are people going to be sheltered as they stand in that portico and actually enter their home. What I finally settled on was a relatively simple elongated shape of the original design. Now, I opted for that because I wanted the entry statement to be a statement, but I didn't want it to be so grand and so overpowering. I wanted it to be relatively synonymous and harmonious with the entire house and like it was always there, whilst also still paying tribute to those original arches, hence the glassed arch front door. Now, ArchiCAD obviously likes to be a pain when you're modeling in a rush, not using the correct wall types, not using the correct materials, or even setting the right heights. So I had to go back, adapt and adjust as much as I could to be able to fine tune and tweak this arch opening and this arch portico to make sure that it actually worked with the glass door and didn't look out of place. All of those lines were seamless and clean. So as you can see, the massing and modeling can go relatively quickly if you're not paying attention to any details. If you're just smashing together an architectural model for the purposes of presentation, you can do this in a couple hours easy. But if you're modeling for architectural documentation, construction, it takes hours just to fine tune one or two details. Nevertheless, once most of that was done, I was able to move into twin motion. Now, the only reason I used Twinmotion this round instead of Enscape was because I've just updated Enscape to 4.1 and it's playing up. So I decided to just jump to Twinmotion to be able to produce this video for you guys this week. When it came to introducing more materials from Twinmotion, it was important that the selection of materials was relatively coastal, but yet relatively modern. So you'll see the introduction of natural stacked stone in the landscaping sections. You'll see clean white render paired with very dark, almost night sky black steel. And then of course, immediately contrasted with that matte white tubular rain screen on the top floor. All of these colors naturally emphasize the landscaping element, which I said was one of my most important elements to add into this architectural design. It was a boring brick and tile home. There was no integration of landscaping. There was no integration of nature. So I really wanted to introduce that landscaping back into the design. Now, all of the cascading plants from this model have been provided by Globe Plants. They're not sponsoring this video at all, but of course, like always, there is a link down in the description if you want to grab some of these Globe Plants assets for yourselves. They have amazing products and vegetation for any country or any continent around the world, and they genuinely have so much that you can find almost anything under the sun. And if you can't, you can simply request them for a custom model and they'll make it for you. As you can see, even with the introduction of just the cascading plants, without the additional plants on top, this building is starting to look a lot more alive, a lot more vibrant, and of course, a lot more premium. But we do need those higher, more mature plants on that planter hood to be able to actually elongate that architecture and show that the landscaping is integrating both naturally, vertically, and horizontally across this entire design. Now, what I noticed as I was working through Twinmotion was I would need to adjust that portico to allow those mature plants to go all the way across behind the portico, which I couldn't be bothered modeling, so I just kind of placed a few plants on the top of the portico. It really wouldn't work like that in real life. The planter bed would be pulled back forward and those plants would wrap and cascade over, allowing this actual scene to come to life. Now, with any render, there's some things that you have to fine tune and some things that you have to tweak. So I had to delete the entire mesh that I made for the back of the property, introduce a floor so that through the windows you could see a beautiful timber floor inside, and fix up some of the overlapping items like the concrete and the pick fencing. Once that was done, I could fine tune a few of the extra landscaping items outside in the additional outdoor entertaining space, as well as in the planter boxes to the right hand side of the property before I started taking my key renderings. Now, because this is an alteration addition project, it's critical that I do before and after photos. Otherwise, you're just seeing the after. And the after might be impressive, but it's even more impressive when it's paired with the original before. I often see so many posts on Instagram, on LinkedIn, anywhere, people showing the end result. The end result is amazing, but the architectural process of how you got there is just as important. That's why during university, we're taught to show our work. We're taught to analyze the wind roses, the wind patterns, the solar studies, and showcase all of that to be able to prove how we got to our final design. It wasn't we just jumped to that final design and it was finished. It's because we actually thought about all of these elements together in one space and then move forward with our design. And the reason I take so many renders and so many screenshots during one of these rendering sessions is because, like I always say, we've done the hard work. We've created the model, we've put in the hard yards to make the design, do the analytical studies, and understand what's going on. So why are we selling ourselves short and exporting only one? If our goal is high-end architectural renders and that's our goal, then that's fine. But for most of us, we're the architects or designers, architectural students, or whatever you may be, who aren't looking to necessarily promote our rendering skills. We're looking to promote our design ideas. So by being able to produce more renders, we're able to produce more work, and then that way we're able to carry our message to more people. Anyway, that's all from me, team. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure you smash that subscribe button down below. And like always, I'll see you next week.